So what is complicated grief?
So when we lose somebody, either naturally or traumatically, we go into a phase of mourning. And in this phase of mourning is when we really kind of process what just happened. So why did this person die? What does this mean for me? And how can I integrate this loss into my story and make sense out of it? So when complicated grief occurs is truly the person is really unable to integrate the loss into their story. So they're not able to make sense of it. They can't find any meaning to it. And they're still struggling with kind of why this happened. And they're stuck. They're very much stuck in kind of that day after this death happened. So there's three, Dr. Catherine Shear kind of has designed three or put together three main kind of signs of complicated grief. And one of those, the first one is troubling thoughts. So this is just something really bothers you about the death. So if we're looking at something about the suicide, we know somebody who survived a loss by suicide is kind of the why. Why did this happen? So the troubling thoughts are centered around trying to figure out why this person decided to take their life. Other troubling thoughts are a lot of resentment towards others who weren't able to prevent this death, resentment towards self for not being able to prevent this death, and resentment sometimes towards the person that you lost as well for leaving you. There's also a lot of thoughts that this just is not fair. It's not fair that this happened to me. I said meaning, so that this death is meaningless. It has no meaning. And the belief that life just isn't possible without this person. So there is no future. There is no moving forward. I'm stuck exactly where I was, and I can't move forward without this loved one. So that's kind of the first thing we see. The second thing we see is an unending emotional pain. And I want to be careful with this one and how I define this, because when you lose somebody, whether naturally or tragically, you have a lot of emotional pain. It hurts, it's sad. But what we're looking for in complicated grief is somebody who's continuing to have that same level of intense pain a year plus after the loss of the person. And this pain is impacting their ability to kind of function on a daily basis. So jobs might be lost, or they haven't been able to go back to their job. Friends, they don't have friends. They don't socialize. It's impacting daily living. And the third kind of main symptom we see is just doing everything in excess to try to avoid the pain. So we don't want to go there. We don't want to think about it. So people, and again, this is a year past the death. This isn't immediately after. So this is something like avoiding certain people, specific places. I've seen a woman who went an extra 20 minutes to work every day because she could not take her usual route because it reminded her of the person that she lost. So just taking extremes to avoid thoughts, people, places that remind them. Also, there's this strong desire and need to try to continue to feel that connection with somebody. So while, keeping a sweatshirt or a couple of shirts from the person that you lost and wanting to wear them every once in a while to feel connected is very much a normal part of life, and incorporating them. This is somebody who, can't take off that shirt, can't wash it, can't take it off, goes into their child's room and refuses to take a single picture down, sleeps in the bed every night. So just doing anything they can to avoid dealing with the pain of the loss. So those are kind of the three main symptoms. And I will say that if you visit the Center for Complicated Grief, they go into even more detail about what kind of these three things look like. There's a number of risk factors that come into play when we're talking about complicated grief, but three of kind of these factors that we see is that the death is violent. The death was traumatic. It was traumatizing to us, and that it just we can't find meaning towards it. So you kind of already have three of the risk factors there. And another big piece of a loss by suicide is shame. It's really, if somebody asks you how your dad died and you say a heart attack, the response is, "Oh, I'm so sorry. and that's kind of it. You tell somebody, hey, my dad died by suicide. He took his own life, and it's like deer in headlights. And so when we as human beings, when we see somebody with that kind of deer in headlights, we automatically become very vulnerable. We're wondering what they're thinking, we're wondering what they're feeling, and we wonder if they're judging not only us, but the person that we lost. So when it comes to this idea of grief, and if we're shameful and we feel like we can't talk about it, we're not going to talk about it. And if there's one thing we know about grief, is that people do not grieve well alone. They need other people. It's incredibly isolating. People ask questions that aren't always appropriate. They make you uncomfortable. We can also kind of feel like the questions that they ask us are almost judgmental. So something sort of, did you see the signs, can be, it can put you on the defense right away, because you kind of want to say, if I saw the signs, they'd probably still be here, or so I would hope they would still be there. I think what's important, though, to remember is people want to understand things. So a lot of times when people are asking questions, don't get me wrong, a lot of times they're completely inappropriate, but they're not judging you and they're not judging the person. A lot of the questions they're asking is out of fear. So when somebody's asking you something like, did you see the signs? I think as a survivor, and I myself am a survivor, the first thing I'm thinking is, I put on my gloves and I go into battle, when really I think the intention of the person behind it is, how can I make sure this doesn't happen to me? Because they're scared. People are really scared that this type of loss is going to happen to them. But that's why when we're talking about this idea of complicated grief and how a tragic loss like suicide can lead to isolation, it's important to not just go to your go-to people and think they're going to be your best support, because they might not be the people who understand, because truly, unless you've been through it, you don't understand. I personally can't ever say that I understand what it's like to battle an addiction, because I've never battled an addiction. That's just, I can't understand. But what we as a survivor need to do in order to kind of either get ourselves out of complicated grief or to avoid going in that direction is finding other people that we can connect with who do understand, or who are empathetic, not sympathetic, to the situation, because there's also a huge issue when it comes to sympathy. Sympathy also a lot of times leads to shame, and we already feel shame. So it's seeking out those people who are empathetic to say, I'm here for you, and not to say, oh, I'm so sorry. Sometimes we don't necessarily want to hear I'm so sorry. We want to just hear, I'm here. I'm here for you. So getting help for complicated grief. First and foremost, it's really important to kind of look at where you are in your grief. So if you are still struggling to think about, to talk about, anything related to the death, you might want to kind of consider seeking out a professional who actually has done work and does work with trauma. Because a lot of times we have to work through the trauma of the death before we can actually do the grief work. Because grief work's a lot about incorporating a loss into our lives. And if it hurts us and it's too difficult to actually talk about the loss, it's very, very hard to incorporate it. So be conscious of if you're seeing some of these signs of either PTSD or just trauma in general. And I will say it's important to keep in mind that even if you didn't find the person that you lost, you still can elicit signs of PTSD or trauma. Sometimes the images that we have in our head are worse than the actual image itself, and that can be difficult to work through. And grief work it's a specialty. It's like addiction work. There's professionals who are trained specifically to work in addictions, and grief is very, very similar. So I encourage you to look for a professional who does not only grief work but has experience with a traumatic loss and how that differs from that of a natural loss. And I would also encourage you to take a look again at the Center for Complicated Grief. I believe they do kind of have a list of therapists who are trained in a specific program to work with people who are suffering with complicated grief. You will see on their site that there are a lot more people than you would think who are living with complicated grief. So know that you are not alone. There are a lot of people out there who are feeling the same way that you are, and there is help. It's just about finding the right person to help you.